Some places are abandoned because time forgets them. Others are abandoned because someone is praying that no one will ever come back. Ethan Walker no longer believed luck had his name written on it. At 37, the former Navy SEAL measured his life in quiet mornings, worn boot soles, and the faithful rhythm of four paws beside him. His old pickup had stopped running 3 weeks earlier outside Spokane, Washington, leaving him with nothing more than a faded backpack, a military duffel, and Ranger, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had crossed deserts, mountains, and silent battlefields without ever questioning where they were headed next. Autumn had settled over eastern Washington with crisp air carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and distant wood smoke drifting lazily from farmhouse chimneys. Golden leaves skated across empty roads while low clouds softened the morning sunlight into pale silver. Ethan walked beneath that quiet sky like a man who had once commanded impossible missions, but now searched only for another place to sleep before nightfall. His beard had grown rough around a weathered face carved by years of discipline and disappointment. His short brown hair had begun to gray around the temples long before most men his age. His pale blue eyes still scanned every tree line, every passing vehicle, every unfamiliar shadow with instincts that refused retirement. Ranger moved beside him without a leash, his sable coat brushed by the cool breeze, ears standing alert, amber eyes constantly measuring the world around the only man he had ever trusted. Neither of them begged. Neither of them complained. They simply kept walking. Near noon, Ethan reached the county courthouse where abandoned properties were being auctioned to settle unpaid taxes. He had wandered inside only because the building was warm. Folding chairs creaked beneath local investors dressed in pressed jackets and polished boots. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room while quiet conversations floated through the air. Ethan remained unnoticed near the back until an elderly clerk glanced toward him with mild curiosity. "You here to bid?" she asked kindly. Ethan almost smiled before reaching into his pocket. He counted every dollar twice. $87.40. The last money he owned in the world. Before he could leave, another property appeared on the projector, an abandoned estate hidden beyond Cedar Ridge. 2 neglected airplanes. 11 antique automobiles. Hundreds of acres. No utilities. No known heirs. No bidders. Laughter spread gently across the room. Someone joked that ghosts paid better taxes than that place ever would. Another investor muttered that even scavengers refused to go near it. The auctioneer shrugged and lowered the minimum bid to exactly $87. The room grew strangely quiet. Ethan stared at the faded photograph of the sprawling mansion standing beneath towering evergreens, its broken windows reflecting a lonely gray sky. Something deep inside him stirred, not hope exactly, but recognition. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked forward. Without barking, he fixed his amber gaze on the image of the forgotten estate, as though he recognized a scent no photograph should ever carry. Ethan looked down at his partner, then back toward the screen. For the first time in years, the silence between them felt less like survival and more like an invitation. The county clerk slid a single brass key across the worn oak counter with an expression that balanced sympathy and disbelief. "Nobody has asked about that place in almost 20 years, she said softly. "If you decide not to stay, no one will blame you." Ethan accepted the key without answering. It felt unexpectedly heavy in his calloused hand, cool from decades spent forgotten inside a locked drawer. Ranger lowered his nose to the old metal, inhaled once, then quietly stepped toward the courthouse door as though he already knew the direction they were meant to travel. By late afternoon, a retired tow truck driver named Walter Briggs agreed to take them to the estate after hearing Ethan had become its legal owner. Walter was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with kind gray eyes and hands permanently stained by grease from 50 years of repairing engines. The old flatbed rumbled along a winding gravel road that climbed steadily through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in narrow golden ribbons while fallen leaves swirled across the road like tiny waves chasing the truck uphill. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. Cell phone service disappeared. Traffic vanished. Even the songs of birds seemed to fade into the forest itself. Nearly an hour later, the trees finally opened, revealing iron gates hanging crooked on weathered stone pillars. Beyond them stretched a long, cracked driveway disappearing toward a mansion that seemed frozen in another lifetime. Ethan stepped from the truck without speaking. The air carried the scent of damp cedar, old stone, wild grass, and rain lingering from the night before. Before him stood an enormous three-story mansion built from gray field stone and dark timber, its windows coated with years of dust, yet strangely unbroken. Ivy climbed across the walls, wrapping balconies and chimneys with patient determination, while moss softened every edge touched by time. Walter removed his cap and slowly shook his head. "People say the owner simply vanished," he murmured. "No funeral. No family came looking. Folks stopped asking questions after a while." Ethan offered a quiet nod before his attention drifted farther across the property. Beyond the mansion rested two private airplanes beneath rusted hangars. Their aluminum skins were dulled by decades of weather, but neither aircraft looked stripped for parts. Nearby, 11 classic automobiles sat beneath faded canvas covers inside an open carriage barn. Even through layers of dust, Ethan recognized elegant lines from another era. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, a Ford Mustang Fastback, a Cadillac Eldorado. Machines that should have been scattered among collectors instead remained perfectly still, waiting in silence. Nothing about the estate matched the stories told inside the courthouse. If thieves had discovered this place, the cars would have disappeared years ago. If vandals had entered, the windows would have been shattered. Instead, everything remained untouched, as though the property itself had been placed gently outside the reach of ordinary time. Ranger wandered slowly across the circular courtyard, nose close to the ground, never rushing. He ignored the mansion entrance completely. He paid no attention to the airplanes or the rows of forgotten automobiles. Instead, he paused for a brief moment near the largest hangar before continuing deeper across the overgrown grounds. Ethan watched him carefully. During their years together, he had learned that Ranger never wasted movement. Every pause meant something. Every change in direction carried purpose. As the evening sun settled behind the mountains, long shadows stretched across the estate, and for the first time since leaving military service, Ethan felt the unmistakable sensation that he had not found this forgotten place by accident. It felt as though, somehow, the forgotten place had been waiting for him. Ranger stopped so suddenly that the silence itself seemed to notice. His ears lifted toward the western edge of the estate where the largest aircraft hangar stood beneath a canopy of towering evergreens. Ethan watched without speaking. The German shepherd had ignored every open doorway, every trail leading toward the mansion, and every tempting scent carried through the cool evening air. Instead, he remained focused on that single weathered building as though an invisible thread stretched between it and some forgotten memory. Ethan followed at a measured pace, his boots crunching softly across gravel scattered with pine needles. The closer they came, the stronger the scent of aged cedar, machine oil, and damp concrete became. It was the unmistakable smell of a place once filled with purpose, now surrendered to time. The hangar doors stood partly open, their steel tracks stained with rust but still intact. Inside, the fading sunlight revealed a polished business jet resting beneath decades of dust. Cobwebs draped gracefully across its wings, yet the tires remained inflated, the windows unbroken, and every instrument visible through the cockpit glass appeared strangely untouched. Ethan slowly walked around the aircraft, studying every detail with the patient awareness that military service had etched into his instincts. Nothing had been stripped. Nothing had been vandalized. It looked less like abandonment and more like someone had expected to return at any moment, only to disappear before that promise could be kept. Ranger barely glanced at the airplane. Instead, he continued toward the rear wall where shelves of neatly organized maintenance tools still lined the concrete. He lowered his nose, inhaled deeply, then paced several slow circles before sitting perfectly still. Ethan recognized the posture immediately. During countless operations overseas, Ranger had used that exact silent signal whenever he detected something important but uncertain. Ethan crouched beside him and rested one hand gently against the dog's shoulder. "What is it, partner?" he whispered. Ranger answered only by lifting his head toward the floor beneath them. Ethan tapped the concrete with the heel of his boot. Solid, cold, ordinary. Yet something about the sound lingered differently beneath the final strike. faint enough that most people would never notice. He struck again a few feet away. This time the echo changed completely before returning to silence. Ethan narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Years of training had taught him that certainty rarely arrived all at once. Outside, the final light of day slipped behind the mountains, casting long blue shadows across the property. A cool wind drifted through broken vents near the roof, carrying the distant scent of rain and whispering through loose sheets of metal with a voice almost human in its softness. Ethan gathered a few old blankets from the mansion, built a small fire inside a stone fireplace that still drew perfectly, and shared the last can of beef stew from his backpack with Ranger. The mansion remained remarkably clean beneath its blanket of dust. Family photographs had been removed, yet books still filled the shelves. A grandfather clock stood frozen at exactly 9:17, and a grand piano rested beneath white linen that no mouse had disturbed. It felt less like entering someone else's home than stepping quietly into a paused memory. Long after darkness settled across the forest, Ethan lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of creaking timber and distant owls. Ranger, however, did not sleep. He remained seated beside the front window, watching toward the hangar without blinking. Around midnight he quietly stood, walked to the front door, and looked back at Ethan only once before returning his gaze toward the darkness outside. It was not fear that shone in the dog's amber eyes. It was patience, as though he already knew the estate was keeping a secret and understood that some truths revealed themselves only to those willing to wait. Morning arrived quietly beneath a pale sky washed in soft silver clouds. Cool mist drifted across the property, wrapping the mansion and its forgotten treasures in a gentle veil that blurred the line between memory and reality. Ethan stepped onto the front porch carrying an old enamel coffee cup he had found in one of the kitchen cabinets. The coffee itself was little more than hot water flavored by the last grounds in his pack, but the warmth felt honest against the autumn chill. Ranger was already gone. Ethan spotted him nearly 200 yards away beside the large hangar, sitting exactly where he had been the evening before. He had not wandered. He had not explored. He simply waited. Ethan smiled faintly. Persistent as always, he murmured before making the long walk across the dew-covered grass. The German shepherd greeted him with one quiet wag of his tail before lowering his nose to the same section of concrete. Again he circled slowly. Again he sat. Again he stared at the floor. Ethan spent most of the morning cleaning the hangar instead of questioning the dog. Dust floated through beams of sunlight pouring from narrow skylights high above. Every sweep of the old push broom revealed concrete that remained remarkably smooth despite its age. Nearby, rows of carefully labeled shelves still held aviation manuals, sealed containers of spare parts, and maintenance logs ending abruptly on the very same date nearly 2 decades earlier. It was as though every clock inside the estate had stopped together. By noon, Ethan noticed something else. The dust covering the floor had settled naturally over the years, except in one narrow section where the pattern looked strangely uneven, almost as if tiny shifts had occurred beneath the surface long after the building had been abandoned. Ranger returned to that exact place and gently scratched the concrete once with his front paw. Not aggressively, not frantically, just once. Then he looked up at Ethan with calm certainty. Ethan crouched beside him and brushed away more dust with his gloved hand. Fine cracks spread across the surface, nearly invisible beneath decades of dirt. They formed straight lines that did not belong to ordinary concrete. He traced one of them with his fingertips until it disappeared beneath an old steel workbench bolted against the wall. Before he could investigate further, the distant sound of tires rolling over gravel echoed outside. Ranger immediately stood and turned toward the driveway. A black luxury sport utility vehicle emerged through the open gates, followed closely by another. They stopped several yards from the mansion. 3 well-dressed men stepped out wearing polished boots far too clean for country roads. The oldest introduced himself as Richard Harlan, a regional real estate investor with neatly combed silver hair and an easy smile that never quite reached his pale eyes. He glanced around the estate with surprising familiarity before extending his hand. "Mr. Walker, congratulations on your purchase. Quite a remarkable piece of property." Ethan accepted the handshake politely, but said nothing. Richard looked toward the airplanes, then the cars, then finally toward the hangar behind Ethan. These old estates can become expensive burdens, he continued pleasantly. Maintenance alone will bury a man. I would be willing to buy the property from you today. Cash, $200,000. The offer hung quietly in the crisp afternoon air. Less than 24 hours earlier, nobody in the county had wanted this forgotten estate. Now strangers had somehow found him before he had even unpacked his backpack. Ethan studied Richard's face with the same careful patience he once reserved for uncertain situations overseas. Beside him, Ranger did not bark or growl. Instead, the German shepherd calmly stepped between Ethan and the visitors before turning his amber eyes back toward the hangar floor, as though reminding his partner that the most valuable thing on the property was not standing above the ground at all. Rain arrived before sunrise, falling gently across the estate in a steady rhythm that softened every sound beneath the towering evergreens. Ethan stood beneath the hangar roof, watching thin streams of water drip from rusted gutters, while Ranger remained fixed to the same place on the concrete floor. Richard Harlan's unexpected offer lingered in Ethan's thoughts through the night. It was not the money that troubled him. It was the timing. Men did not drive hours into the mountains to buy abandoned property unless they already believed it held something worth protecting or hiding. The former Navy SEAL had learned long ago that urgency often revealed more than words ever could. As the rain eased into a cool mist, Ethan searched the maintenance room and discovered a heavy steel pry bar hanging neatly on an old pegboard beside several hand tools preserved by dry air and careful craftsmanship. He returned to the cracked section of concrete, while Ranger quietly stepped aside without taking his eyes off the floor. Ethan slid the workbench several inches away from the wall. Dust rolled into the air, carrying the smell of iron and aged cedar. Beneath the bench, the straight cracks formed a nearly perfect rectangle that no ordinary foundation would create by accident. He brushed away years of dirt with an old shop towel until narrow steel edges appeared beneath the concrete dust. His heartbeat remained calm, but curiosity settled deeper with every passing minute. Using the pry bar, he carefully tested one corner. At first nothing happened. Then a faint metallic click echoed beneath the floor. Ranger immediately stood, ears forward, tail perfectly still. Ethan applied steady pressure once more. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the hidden slab shifted upward less than an inch before stopping. Cold air drifted through the narrow opening. It carried no scent of mold or decay. Instead, it smelled dry, clean, and strangely untouched, like paper stored inside a vault. Ethan widened the gap enough to reveal a narrow steel ladder disappearing into darkness. He found an old industrial flashlight still hanging beside the workshop entrance. To his surprise, fresh batteries rested unopened inside the same cabinet. Minutes later, the beam of light pierced the darkness below. The ladder descended nearly 20 feet into a reinforced underground chamber built from thick poured concrete. Every wall remained perfectly dry despite the passing decades. Ethan climbed carefully while Ranger followed without hesitation, placing each paw precisely on the steel rungs. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed shelves stretching across the room from floor to ceiling. Ethan expected to find gold bars, stacks of cash, or forgotten jewelry. Instead, he found something far more surprising. Thousands of meticulously labeled document boxes filled the shelves. Leather-bound ledgers rested beside sealed metal cases. Rolled architectural blueprints occupied one corner. Fireproof cabinets lined another. Every box carried typed labels with dates, company names, aviation projects, property deeds, investment accounts, charitable foundations, engineering patents, and handwritten journals. On a polished oak table rested a thick envelope bearing only 4 words in faded black ink. For whoever finds this. Ethan carefully picked it up, noticing that the paper beneath remained perfectly preserved. Before opening it, he looked around the silent chamber once more. Nothing here suggested greed. Everything suggested preparation. Someone had not hidden wealth beneath this hangar. Someone had hidden the truth. Ranger quietly walked to one of the locked filing cabinets and gently rested his nose against it before looking back at Ethan. The German shepherd had not dug for treasure. He had led his partner to a story buried beneath concrete, waiting patiently for someone with enough integrity to uncover it rather than exploit it. The envelope felt unexpectedly light in Ethan's hands, yet the silence surrounding it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. He carefully broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded several neatly typed pages whose edges had yellowed but remained perfectly preserved. The first line immediately captured his attention. "If you are reading this, then honesty has finally reached this place before greed did." There was no signature at the top, only calm words written by someone who had expected years, perhaps decades, to pass before another trustworthy soul stood inside the hidden chamber. Ethan continued reading while Ranger lay quietly beside the oak table, his amber eyes never leaving his partner. The letter explained that the estate had belonged to Jonathan Ashford, an aviation engineer and entrepreneur whose companies had designed aircraft components used across the country. He had spent decades building businesses, creating scholarships, funding veterans' rehabilitation programs, and quietly supporting families who never knew his name. But success had attracted men who admired wealth more than character. Rather than surrender everything he had built into dishonest hands, Jonathan had transferred every legal record, every ownership certificate, every charitable trust agreement, and every original contract into the underground archive before disappearing from public life. Ethan turned another page. There was no dramatic confession, no hidden fortune map, no accusation written in anger. Instead, Jonathan described a simple fear that truth could disappear if paper disappeared with it. Every original deed, patent, investment agreement, and financial ledger had been preserved beneath the hangar because duplicates had slowly been altered elsewhere over many years. Whoever controlled the official records above ground could eventually rewrite ownership itself. Ethan slowly walked toward one of the steel filing cabinets Ranger had indicated moments earlier. Using a key hanging neatly from the envelope, he unlocked the cabinet and carefully pulled open the heavy drawer. Inside rested rows of sealed binders labeled with familiar corporate names that still existed across the Pacific Northwest. Beneath them lay notarized property transfers, partnership agreements, engineering patents, handwritten correspondence, and photographs documenting meetings that stretched back more than 20 years. One leather folder immediately caught Ethan's attention. Across its cover appeared a single typed name, Richard Harlan. Ethan opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of contracts, acquisition proposals, and private letters revealing repeated attempts to purchase Jonathan Ashford's companies at deeply unfair prices. Every offer had been declined. The final document described legal disputes that had never reached court because Jonathan had quietly withdrawn from public life before they concluded. Ethan leaned back in thoughtful silence. Nothing before him proved a crime. It revealed something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. A long history of pressure, persistence, and unanswered questions surrounding valuable businesses that had changed ownership only after their founder disappeared. Ranger gently nudged Ethan's elbow, drawing his attention toward another cabinet standing alone against the far wall. This one contained dozens of carefully indexed videotapes, digital storage drives sealed inside waterproof containers, and a printed inventory describing recorded board meetings, financial audits, and personal journals. Jonathan had documented everything, not because he expected revenge, but because he believed truth deserved the chance to survive longer than memory. Ethan closed the cabinet with quiet respect. Outside, afternoon sunlight filtered through the narrow ventilation shafts, sending warm beams across the underground floor. Above them, the forgotten mansion remained silent beneath the whispering pines, while somewhere beyond the gates, men like Richard Harlan likely believed the greatest secret on the property was buried beneath concrete. They were wrong. The greatest treasure waiting beneath the hangar was not wealth hidden from the world. It was a lifetime of carefully protected truth waiting for someone who valued integrity more than ownership. For a long time, Ethan simply sat beneath the warm glow of the underground lights, listening to the quiet breathing of Ranger and the distant whisper of wind filtering through hidden ventilation shafts. The silence did not feel empty. It felt patient, as though the chamber itself had spent years waiting for someone who would understand that truth carried responsibilities greater than ownership. He gathered only the documents directly connected to Jonathan Ashford's letter, the original property deeds, the notarized trust agreements, the folders concerning Richard Harlan, and several inventories proving the archive had remained untouched. Everything else stayed exactly where Jonathan had left it. Ethan carefully locked every cabinet before closing the steel vault behind him. He did not tell anyone about the hidden room. Not yet. Early the next morning, he drove an old utility truck he had repaired on the estate into the nearest town. The truck coughed and rattled along the mountain road, but it reached the county offices without complaint. Ranger sat quietly beside him, watching passing forests roll by beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan requested a meeting with Sheriff Daniel Brooks, a steady man in his late 50s whose weathered face reflected decades of listening before judging. Ethan placed the envelope and a handful of original documents on the sheriff's desk without exaggeration or dramatic explanation. He simply said, "I believe these belong in careful hands." Sheriff Brooks spent nearly an hour examining the records. His expression changed slowly from curiosity to thoughtful concern. Finally, he looked up and asked one question. "Did you remove anything else from that property?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. Everything else remains exactly where I found it." The sheriff studied him for another quiet moment before extending his hand. "Thank you for leaving it that way." Within days, specialists from state archives, legal investigators, and financial examiners arrived at the estate with careful respect rather than urgency. Every box was photographed before being moved. Every document was cataloged exactly where Jonathan had intended it to be found. Ethan never interfered. He answered questions when asked, then quietly returned to repairing fences, clearing fallen branches, and caring for the neglected grounds while Ranger followed faithfully through every task. News traveled quickly across the county. The forgotten mansion was no longer whispered about as a haunted estate. It became known as one of the most remarkable historical discoveries in the region. Historians found original engineering patents that had been thought lost forever. Charitable foundations located authentic trust records proving scholarships and veterans programs had never legally ended. Families who believed inherited property had disappeared decades earlier received long-awaited confirmation that their claims had always been legitimate. The greatest surprise came several weeks later when investigators publicly announced that the archive revealed no stolen fortune, no hidden criminal empire, and no dramatic conspiracy. Instead, it preserved something far more valuable. It protected the legal truth behind millions of dollars in businesses, charitable assets, intellectual property, and family estates whose ownership had gradually become clouded after Jonathan Ashford disappeared from public life. The carefully preserved originals allowed courts and trustees to correct records through lawful processes, restoring rights that paperwork alone had quietly erased over many years. Richard Harlan appeared briefly on local television, insisting he had only wished to purchase neglected property as an investment. His smile remained polished, but the confidence behind it had faded. Business reporters soon revealed that several companies connected to his investment group voluntarily withdrew pending ownership claims, while independent legal reviews continued. Ethan followed none of the broadcasts. He found greater satisfaction replacing broken porch boards and polishing the brass nameplate beside the mansion entrance until Jonathan Ashford's family name shone once again beneath the afternoon sun. One evening, Sheriff Brooks returned alone carrying a small wooden box. He handed it to Ethan without ceremony. Inside rested Jonathan's weathered pocket watch along with a handwritten note discovered beneath the final shelf of the archive. The note contained only one sentence. "If this estate ever breathes again, let it welcome those who protected others before themselves." Ethan closed the box slowly, his eyes drifting toward Ranger resting peacefully beneath the old maple tree. The German shepherd opened one amber eye and gently wagged his tail, as though he already understood what those simple words truly meant. Some victories never arrived with applause. They arrived quietly, carried by honesty, preserved by loyalty, and uncovered one careful step at a time by a man and a faithful dog who had nothing left to prove except the value of doing the right thing. Winter arrived gently across Cedar Ridge, dusting the mountaintops with fresh snow while the valley below glowed beneath clear blue skies. The estate no longer felt forgotten. Fresh paint covered weathered fences, broken shutters had been repaired, and warm light once again shone through windows that had remained dark for nearly 20 years. Ethan never tried to restore the mansion into something grand. He simply brought it back to life one careful day at a time. Every repaired step, every cleaned room, Every polished railing honored the man who had trusted that one day the truth would find its rightful guardian. Ranger stayed close through every task, carrying old gloves in his mouth, following Ethan from sunrise until the stars quietly reclaimed the sky each evening. Several months after the archive had been authenticated, a group of attorneys and trustees arrived at the estate carrying thick binders instead of briefcases filled with negotiations. They gathered around the original oak dining table where Jonathan Ashford had once hosted family dinners decades earlier. The lead attorney, Margaret Ellis, unfolded a final document discovered among Jonathan's personal papers. It contained instructions written years before his disappearance. Jonathan had anticipated that whoever eventually uncovered the archive honestly, protected the evidence, and surrendered it without seeking personal gain would receive a permanent stewardship interest in the estate along with a lawful portion of the recovered trust income generated by the businesses his records ultimately restored. Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. The numbers meant very little to him. He had spent enough years sleeping beneath open skies to understand that security was measured less by bank accounts than by the people and principles that remained beside you when everything else disappeared. Margaret smiled gently before sliding another folder across the table. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, "Mr. Ashford believed character was the only inheritance that could never be stolen." Weeks later, the legal process concluded. The restored trusts resumed supporting scholarship programs, veterans assistance initiatives, aviation education, and local charities exactly as Jonathan had intended. Ethan accepted only what had been lawfully left to him. His first purchase surprised nearly everyone who knew the story. Instead of luxury vehicles or expensive renovations, he acquired several neighboring acres and transformed old barns into a rehabilitation center for retired military working dogs and struggling veterans rebuilding civilian lives. The restored hangar became a place where mechanics volunteered beside former service members to rebuild classic aircraft and antique automobiles as therapy rather than business. Laughter gradually replaced silence beneath the old steel roof. The sound of tools striking metal blended with conversations that carried hope instead of regret. Ranger became the quiet heart of the entire property. New arrivals often noticed him before they noticed anyone else. He greeted anxious veterans with gentle patience, walked beside nervous rescue dogs without demanding trust, and somehow seemed to understand exactly who needed silent companionship more than words. Children visiting with their families loved hearing the story of the faithful German shepherd who refused to leave one forgotten spot beneath an abandoned hangar. Ethan always smiled whenever they asked whether Ranger had really found treasure. He would kneel beside his old friend, scratch behind those familiar ears, and answer the same way every time. No, Ranger found something much harder to bury. As golden lights settled across the estate one peaceful evening, the restored airplanes reflected the colors of the sunset. The classic automobiles gleamed inside the renovated barn, and warm laughter drifted from the community workshop where strangers had slowly become neighbors. Ethan stood quietly on the porch with Jonathan's pocket watch resting comfortably in his hand while Ranger leaned against his leg, content and unhurried. The mansion had once stood empty because people believed nothing valuable remained inside. Now it stood full again. Not because of wealth, but because one loyal dog had trusted his instincts, and one weary man had chosen honesty over opportunity, allowing forgotten promises to become living blessings once more. Spring returned quietly to Cedar Ridge, carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers, fresh pine, and clean mountain air across the hills that surrounded the old estate. Where silence had once settled like dust, life now moved with gentle purpose. Veterans gathered each Saturday beneath the restored hangar, teaching young volunteers how to rebuild antique engines, repair worn wooden wings, and polish forgotten machines until they reflected the morning sun once again. Retired military dogs wandered peacefully across the wide green fields, no longer defined by the work they had completed, but by the love they still had to give. Ethan often watched from the front porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, grateful for ordinary mornings that once seemed impossible. Ranger had grown a little slower over the passing seasons. Soft strands of silver now touched his muzzle, and his steps carried the quiet confidence of a soul that no longer hurried anywhere. Yet every morning, without fail, he still walked toward the old hangar before the rest of the property awakened. He would pause over the exact place where he had first refused to leave, sit for a moment beneath the rising sun, then calmly return to Ethan's side. It became a ritual neither of them ever questioned. One afternoon, a young Marine recovering from injuries asked Ethan why Ranger always visited that same place. Ethan looked toward his old partner before answering with the faint smile that had slowly returned to his face after so many difficult years. "He is reminding himself where hope began," he said quietly. "The rest of us are just lucky enough to remember with him." The words stayed with everyone who heard them. Months later, a small bronze plaque was placed beside the hangar entrance. It carried no mention of fortunes, court records, airplanes, or valuable estates. Instead, it simply read, "Truth was preserved here because loyalty arrived before greed." Visitors often stood silently before those words. Some placed a hand upon the weathered bronze. Others simply looked toward Ranger lying peacefully beneath the nearby maple tree, understanding without needing further explanation. On warm summer evenings, the restored property, filled with quiet laughter, acoustic music, and families sharing meals beneath strings of soft lights stretched between old oak trees. Children chased one another across the same courtyard that had once stood empty beneath years of neglect. Veterans who had arrived carrying invisible burdens found themselves smiling more often than they had expected. Rescue dogs who had forgotten how to trust slowly discovered gentle hands waiting patiently beside them. Ethan never claimed credit for any of it. Whenever someone thanked him for saving the estate, he would simply glance toward Ranger and reply, "I only followed the one who knew where to stop." As the years continued their quiet work, Jonathan Ashford's pocket watch remained on the mantel above the stone fireplace, ticking steadily after being carefully restored by a local craftsman. It reminded Ethan that time could hide many things, but it could never erase kindness faithfully remembered. One golden evening, as the sun settled behind the distant mountains and painted the sky with shades of amber and deep blue, Ethan sat beside Ranger on the wide front porch. The old German shepherd rested his head gently against Ethan's knee while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar through the peaceful valley below. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Some stories end with treasure, some end with justice. But the rarest stories end with grace, when a weary man discovers that home is not the place he inherits, but the life he builds through quiet integrity, and when a faithful dog reminds the world that the greatest things ever uncovered are not buried beneath the earth, but hidden within the hearts that refuse to abandon what is right.